Welcome to our different room for session number 16 of Philosophers in the Midst of History. This is a series that we've been doing, hosted here at the Frank Weinberg Library for 3 years now, and we're hopefully going to be scheduling another fourth year of it coming up soon. We start out with an author from ancient philosophy, and we talk about their historical context and the contributions that they made to history itself during the spring. And then in the summer, we do somebody from the medieval period. Then in the fall, we do somebody early modern. And then in the winter, which we're now officially in, since we have snow falling outside, we do somebody late modern, usually 20th century, although we did do Nietzsche one time, so late 19th century, early 20th century. And today we're doing somebody who I'm a big fan of, and that's Simone de Beauvoir. And what I'd like to say first about her, before I talk a little bit about what we usually do in the session, is that she, in recent years, has started to become recognized as important in philosophy on her own account. All too often in the past, I think because she was so closely associated with Jean-Paul Sartre, and because of some of the very issues that have to do with gender and men and women and things that feminists were critiques of, the things she diagnosed in her second sex, she was often looked at as like being Sartre's sidekick or his helper, his muse, or things like that. And her she wrote great novels. And she wrote this, Ethics of Ambiguity. That's kind of cool to take a look at if you've got extra time when you're studying the existentialists. But Sartre is the real big thing. And I think people have come to recognize now that, no, that's not the case at all. And it wasn't just because she also wrote, a big, thick book of her own, The Second Sex, which has been incredibly important in feminist circles. But people now recognize that her philosophical work is really, just as good and just as important as that of Jean-Paul Sartre, and that there's a lot of philosophy, straight-out philosophy, in things like The Second Sex or her essay on de Sade, or and in her novels. So I think that's kind of a cool thing. There's a new biography of her out now, which I was reading a little bit of an interview with the author of it, and the author was getting criticized for not talking much about Sartre, and she replied, "Hasn't there been enough of that? I thought that that story is pretty clear. Let's actually focus on de Beauvoir." So it's impossible not to talk about Sartre, which we're going to do, but I think it is important to recognize her importance as a thinker, really of the first rank in her own right, and as somebody who straddles a couple different fences. In terms of feminism, she is one of the most important voices of what they have come to call second wave feminism. But in the existentialist movement, she's just as important as Friedrich Nietzsche or Søren Kierkegaard or Albert Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre or Martin Heidegger. I think she's just as important as all of those figures. So generally what we do in these, and you can feel free to interrupt me at any point to ask questions if you want to. What I do is I present the life of the person and talk a bit about their works. And the idea is to situate them within the history that they lived in. Philosophy doesn't get done in a vacuum. It's, the things that people are focusing on are products of what the larger culture is concerned with, or massive events. In de Beauvoir's case, there's a lot of, kind of quirky, contingent things that affect her life that are quite central and important, and her philosophy can take account of that. So we want to talk about that, and then I'll talk about some of her key ideas as well from some of her works, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about how she ended up contributing to history. And I think that's still an ongoing project, you could say. maybe project isn't the right word. She's still exerting effects through history right now. So she gets brought up during discussions of the Me Too movement, for example, which is very recent. This whole sort of activist focus on bringing to light all the terrible things that people have been doing and which have been covered up or stuffed down for years and years within a forum, primarily Twitter at first, where people could actually bring their stories out and be believed and have some solidarity on that sort of thing. So let's talk about her life. She's born, I'll give you a little timeline here. She's born in 1908, born in Paris itself. Her father was this legal secretary, Georges Bertrand de Beauvoir, and he had aspirations of being an actor. Her mother was a very different sort, Françoise Brasseur originally, and then, she takes the Beauvoir name. She was a wealthy banker's daughter and a devout Catholic. And Simone de Beauvoir later talks about, in this memoir that she writes called The Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, a little bit of self-promotion there, I guess. She talks about her father's individualism and pagan ethical standards, So in a way, it's sort of like Augustine, right? Augustine has got a pagan dad and a devout Catholic mother, right? De Beauvoir's got kind of a similar thing, and she says that it was in complete contrast to the rigidly moral conventionalism of my mother's teaching, and she said that actually contributed to her becoming an intellectual. There was, when you have, if everybody believes the same thing, you don't really need to think, right? You just kind of learn it and then follow along, and when you screw up, just see what everybody else does and kind of follow along that path, and you won't screw up anymore. But when you've got real clashes over central issues, like, is it important to care what the neighbors think? Or should you go to church every weekend, or sleep in, or does God exist, or those sorts of things, and people that you see in your household take different positions, then well, for some people that leads to neurosis, right? But for others, it can lead to saying, well, there must be something going on here. These people seem to be reasonable, and yet they don't agree. How can I figure out some solutions myself? So she says that played an important role in her becoming an intellectual. She calls it a disequilibrium which made my life kind of an endless disputation, which is a nice turn of phrase. Now, she winds up in her family, winds up in financial difficulties after the war. World War I took an incredible toll, not just on the population of France. A whole generation of young men, many of them died on the Western Front. That's part of what led to the transformation of French culture. But there were also a lot of economic dislocations, and her family seems to have suffered from that as well. And in a way, it's not good that they suffered that way, but it led to even more, you could say, factors that freed her from the expectations of the culture that she was growing up in. One of the big expectations is that a girl should have a dowry. This was even for people who were, thinking that they were nonconformists. Well, they still liked money, and having a dowry was quite important. There wasn't any possibility of that, so that led to her not being able to marry, and she decided to go off and pursue work instead and study and be independent. Whereas, she might have been tempted had her family been more well off or weathered the economic downturns better. She might have had a more conventional life. So she decides to go off and study philosophy. She passes the baccalaureate for mathematics and philosophy. studies mathematics at the Institut Catholique and literature and languages at the Institut Sainte-Marie. And then she goes to live with her grandmother in 1926 and starts studying philosophy and literature at the Sorbonne. Within a few years, she graduates. She has a thesis on Leibniz. And now she's sort of like moving up, right? In the French, we think of like, well, you go to your high school and then, college, and then maybe you go on and get your PhD or something like that. Or probably you're done and you go on to professional life, or maybe you go on and do a professional school. Well, the French system is very hierarchical and some very orderly steps. Even still today, but even more back then. So she starts going to the École Normale. Now this is sort of like the big time. And there she meets Jean-Paul Sartre, and they, fall in love. He actually does propose at that time, but she has to reveal that she has no dowry, and it's not really going to be feasible for them. And they begin this relationship that we'll talk a little bit more about. That's quite controversial, and there's a lot of different interpretations of what was going on with them. But it's a relationship that lasts their entire life. She's there when he dies. There were a lot of coming and goings, I think you could say, in their relationship. That's maybe a good way to summarize it. But they were the two central pillars. It's kind of funny. I'll just say this, and then I want to get back to talking about her studies. So we usually think of a relationship as, primarily a couple, right? They did a lot of triangles. And so you've got two pillars that are, always there, and then there's usually like a third pillar of some sort, but it's a pillar you can swap in and out. But maybe it needed to be there for the kind of relationship that they were having, if we want to use some architectural metaphors. So in any case, she's going and she's studying, and she in a interview that she gave in 1965, she actually said, "My studies gave me only a superficial knowledge of philosophy," which is not surprising given the way that philosophy was being taught at the time, "but sharpened my interest in it." And then she later on would go on and start teaching. She starts teaching at these lycées, and a lycée is basically like a high school, but it's different than our high schools. In our, culture, the American system, right? Whatever we have that's a system, we don't generally do philosophy in high school. If we do, it might be smuggled in, like in a social studies section, or maybe if they're doing a biology class, they might get into some philosophical topics like what is life or things like that. But we don't usually have whole classes on it. Unless it's taught as an English elective or social studies elective in a well-heeled private school, or it's taught usually as a religion elective in Catholic and sometimes other Christian schools as well. But it's kind of a strange thing to encounter, right? In the French system, you study philosophy. There's no option. You have to pass a philosophy test in order to graduate. And so, there was a big demand for philosophy teachers. And that's what she did. She starts teaching. And what she ends up saying, again, in that interview is, "I benefited greatly from being a teacher. That is, from being able to spend a great deal of time reading, writing, and educating myself. In those days, teachers didn't have a very heavy program. My studies gave me a solid foundation because in order to pass the state exams, you had to explore areas that you wouldn't bother about if you were only concerned with general culture." And on a personal note, I can say that there's really something to that. When I did my undergraduate, I went to a school where it was really a lot of benign neglect. There was a program for philosophy, but there were very few of us actually studying it, and the professors weren't particularly engaged, and they didn't really pay much attention to what we were doing so long as we didn't get in trouble. And so, I just kind of read whatever I wanted to read. I knew what I was supposed to read, and sometimes I'd read it and sometimes I wouldn't, and I could kind of BS enough to get through my classes, even if I didn't read the stuff. And so my education was kind of, scattershot. And then I went to graduate school, and I was fortunate to go to a place that, although it was low ranked, had some really good teachers, and it had a very rigorous set of examinations that we had to pass at the master's and PhD level that they've long since gotten rid of because too many students were not doing well with them. And so it caused problems. But those of us who went through that sort of baptism by long, arduous fire lasting, over years, where you'd have this massive reading list and you had to, read the stuff that was on it and memorize large parts of it and then take exams on it that you'd have to write out by hand. Okay, well, that gave me a really good foundation because there were, like she was saying, there's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have read otherwise. Like, for example, John Dewey. I went to a place where John Dewey, there were a lot of acolytes of him, but I couldn't really stand them. And I didn't like Dewey, but I had to read him in order to pass those exams. And I'm glad that I did because there were some cool things in Dewey and, in other thinkers as well. But then when you start teaching, and, it's one thing to be a graduate student, right? And you're talking with fellow graduate students who are also interested in philosophy and they know your lingo and you can do kind of shorthand with them verbally. You don't have to spell everything out. It's a whole nother thing to be in a classroom with a bunch of kids who have no idea what the hell you're doing. They just know it's philosophy and they're kind of nervous about the class and they don't really want to be there, and it's up to you to somehow not only convince them that it's not all just crazy nonsense, but to get the ideas across to them without making recourse to jargon and finding examples that they can relate to. That's where you really start to learn your subject better. And so I think she's right about that. So she eventually is going to continue this teaching. I do want to bring up one other thing that came up in a biography of hers as well. This is from Deirdre Baer. She reported that the jury for the agrégation, which is this test that she and Jean-Paul Sartre had to take, they scored first and second in the test. Now, what's really interesting is that the jury debated about who they should give the first place to, and they gave it to Sartre. Now, a lot of the people, think that they should have given it to de Beauvoir. It was Sartre's second try, and he was a guy, so they, decided that he should be the one to get it. But they apparently agreed that she was the real philosopher compared to him. And she was the youngest agrégée at that time in French history. So she's, quite brilliant. She eventually begins teaching at the Sorbonne in 1941. Before that, through this long period while she's involved with Sartre, she meets this woman, Olga Kosakiewicz, who is essentially she's the person who essentially is one of the characters in this first novel, She Came to Stay, which is published in 1943, which is about a triangle. In 1935, de Beauvoir proposed that Olga should put herself under her and Sartre's protection. They would pay her way, be responsible for her education, and they actually began an affair together. Then Sartre tried to seduce her. As far as I remember, wasn't successful, and it became kind of a scandalous matter. Around the same time, too, de Beauvoir tries to get a work published. This When Things of the Spirit Come First gets rejected by press after press. And then in 1943, there's a bit of a catastrophe. Also a good thing. She writes She Came to Stay and publishes it, but she's suspended from her teaching position. In part because she's accused of seducing a 17-year-old student earlier in 1939. This had become sort of a part of their MO, Sartre and de Beauvoir. de Beauvoir would find these young, I guess you could say, kind of impressionable women, and then start up a friendship with them, and have an affair, and then Sartre would he'd come in on the wings, and hopefully they'd all be like one big happy family, I guess you could say. Didn't always turn out that way, but she's accused essentially of procuring women for Sartre. Now, if you know anything about Jean-Paul Sartre and how he looked, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the guy. He was not a looker. De Beauvoir was. Sartre certainly had personality, but in terms of like the sheer attractiveness, de Beauvoir was much more attractive than him, and they had essentially an open relationship. Sartre proposed what he called a pact, an agreement. They could have affairs, but they were required to tell each other everything. And he framed it in terms of they have an essential love, but then they could also experience contingent love affairs. So he's putting it in philosophical terms, which she was quite fine with. And, this led to these triangles. There's an interesting thing by Louis Manon in this New Yorker article. He says, one theory of what was going on is clearly wrong. That is the theory that her relationship with Sartre was a post-patriarchal partnership of equals, combining genuine mutuality with genuine autonomy, and rejecting the superstitious equation of sexual fidelity with commitment, an open marriage. It's now clear that Sartre and de Beauvoir did not simply have a long-term relationship supplemented by independent affairs with other people. The affairs with other people formed the very basis of their relationship. The swapping and sharing and mimicking, the memoir and novel writing, right down to the interviews and published letters and dueling estates was the stuff and substance of their marriage. That was how they slept with each other, and after they stopped sleeping with each other, the third parties were, in effect, this is a really great line, prostheses, marital aids. So the idea was that they're using these other people and their problems and their whatever they're bringing to the table as ways to relate to each other, and I think that I find that pretty convincing myself. So, that's an interesting part of their relationship. During the war, Sartre, of course, was in the army and taken as a prisoner of war. Nothing really bad happened to him other than being, stuck in barracks. He writes in notebooks about, the worst thing was being bored. So it's not like, they're going to execute him or anything. De Beauvoir ends up working for the Vichy government in a way that drew some criticism of collaboration afterwards. But what she actually did was contributed to a radio show. She was doing a radio show, if I remember right. I have to check my notes for a second. It was on classical music or history. So it's yeah, that's right. Music in the Middle Ages. But, they would eventually become part of this whole existentialist circle and movement. They start Les Temps Modernes, Modern Times, named after the Chaplin film. And the original editorial board included Sartre and de Beauvoir, but also Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and a number of other people like Raymond Aron, important French intellectual later on, very critical of the communists. And Sartre said that the review's purpose was to publish what they call littérature engagée, which is committed writing, writing that would by doing short stories or plays or novels, take stands on things. Not just trying to depict what happened by itself, but to take a point of view. But to do it in a way that would be not just sort of like using the characters as ideological masks for whatever thing. So they're not going to just have the Marxist and the capitalist and the worker or anything like that. They're trying to depict genuine people within real life situations, but in an imaginative way that would have some greater depth to it. Or they would take classical themes and rework them. Now, de Beauvoir does that in some of her works. One great example is one of her few plays. She only publishes one as far as I know, and it's called The Useless Mouths, Les Bouches Inutiles. It's also called Who Must Die, because the central question of it is can't save everybody, who is actually going to die. It takes place in a 14th century Flemish town under siege, and the town revolts and takes charge of their own destiny, and the people are starving under the revolt. Then this guy, Jean-Pierre, crosses the lines to try to find what's going on. There's all sorts of issues getting mixed in there, love, taking part in government, the point of the revolt. And then they're faced with a quandary. What are they going to do? The Burgundians are still around them. They only have enough food for some of the population. Do they continue their revolt? How is that going to happen? Was everybody going to die? Well, maybe we should kill some of the people. Maybe we should just withhold food from those who can't really help. And the town council decides to get rid of the useless mouths, who are the women and children and the aged. So, and this is to go to the theme of the history. I mean, this is something that is coming out of, this is written in 1945, around the same time that the Nazis have been defeated. The Nazis themselves were calling human beings for over a decade not useless mouths, but life not worthy of life, and they'd done that. They'd taken the insane and people with chronic illnesses and killed them. So she's working with some key ideas. She has a few other ones that I think would be kind of good to mention as well. There's another work called The Blood of Others. This takes place during World War II. There's this guy, Jean Beauvoir, who's a wealthy young man and who leaves his family and joins the Communist Party. And he meets this woman, Helene, who is an individualist, living just for the moment, kind of a party girl in some respect. Doesn't understand his commitment to his beliefs. And then he has to choose. He comes to a junction where he has to decide between his political commitments and his activism and his private responsibilities. It's one of these typical dilemmas, right? And he realizes that he can find his freedom in his commitments and in action, leaving love behind. And so, playing around with really fundamental questions that people do in fact face. As time goes on, Le Temps Moderne starts out with all these people involved. Raymond Aron quit by 1945, in part because Le Temps Moderne supported communism. And around the time of the Korean War, Maurice Merleau-Ponty would resign from it as well. As a matter of fact, one of the themes that you can say that characterizes Sartre and de Beauvoir as a couple, not in the romantic sense now, but as like a partnership in terms of existentialist thought, is it's them against everybody else sooner or later. Another important person who they worked with was Albert Camus, and pretty soon they break with him as well over the Algerian War. They always were on each other's side. They always, as we say, had each other's backs, but their commitments and their arguments often distanced them from their original collaborators over time. And I think that's kind of common in these sort of intense partnerships like that. So going on, you can see she writes quite a few works. She begins traveling in 1947, taking a 5-month trip in the United States, and she starts writing, you could call it travel literature, sort of reflections on what she's seeing in different places. Like here, so she writes a book called America Day by Day, and she observes things about, like, say, the American South and American segregation and racism. And she's very much a person who's on the side of the marginalized, the oppressed, those who are in many respects less free. She's awarded an important prize, the Prix Goncourt, in 1954. By 1958, things start to fall apart in France, and Charles de Gaulle takes power. And if you know de Gaulle, he was a war hero. He was the one who led the Free French. He also was before the French lost World War II. In the very early part, he was one of the guys who was like saying the right things and being ignored by the French military establishment. So he had a lot of what we nowadays call social capital, right? He's somebody who's going to be believed, and he's fairly right wing, but he's somebody who can more or less unify the French, and he was able to resolve the Algerian conflict by actually pulling out, whereas the conservatives before that couldn't do that, and nobody could really attain some sort of consensus. He was able to use that capital to do that. De Beauvoir begins traveling to a number of different places around the world, and again, sort of checking out what do things look like on the ground where you are. What does life, what do conflicts look like? What does the way in which women are being treated? How do these things play out? She doesn't she doesn't just sort of like write about, say, Cuba from reading travel magazines. She wants to go there and see what's actually happening, or America, or other places in the world. She writes the memoirs of a dutiful daughter. Publishes that in 1958. Her mother doesn't die until 1964, it's I think you probably should wait until after, because then they can't say anything bad about it, right? And she's involved in quite a bit of activism. She was involved in the Manifesto of the 343. This was a declaration that was signed by 343 women who admitted to having abortions, which at that time was illegal. It's very interesting. This is a bit of a side note about abortion. So she talks about this in The Second Sex, and she brings it up as an instance of male hypocrisy, that they're perfectly happy in using abortion as a form of contraception. Abortion was technically illegal and quite expensive in some cases in France, but it was widely available. You just had to break the law. And so, men and women would get together, and the woman gets pregnant, and then the guy's like, well, you got to do something about this, and then oftentimes they would give them money. And essentially, de Beauvoir is saying, the way things are set up is essentially forcing women into positions of, no matter what they do, they're screwed. Complicity with one thing or another. And since it's men who are setting up all the rules and then, sort of like running the game, this is really drastically unfair. Interestingly, one of Sartre's later novels in this series that he calls the Paths of Freedom, the Chemin de Liberté in French, the very first novel, The Age of Reason, is about this guy who's basically Sartre. He's a university professor. He's chasing after these younger female students. He's kind of indecisive about things, but he's living a bohemian lifestyle. He's not certain that he's involved with a woman who he can't stand, who he gets pregnant. and then has to figure out, where he's going to get the funds for an abortion from. But that's the sort of like the entire preoccupation of that first novel. We've got to get this woman, to the abortion. They didn't have abortion clinics. To the doctor to have this done. Where am I going to get the money? I'm going to hit up my bourgeois brother who tells me I'm not going to do this for you because you have to reach the age of reason now. Can I find it anywhere else? And he's frantically going around. And eventually, what ends up happening is she decides to keep the baby, and this homosexual guy marries her to be what we nowadays call a beard. The cover for that, and he's free of his obligations, and he goes back to his life. And Sartre could write that kind of novel because he's a guy. Whereas Simone de Beauvoir, she looks at that and she's like, this is kind of BS. What's going on here. So in 1971, signing this manifesto, this is many years after they've written these things, but signing that manifesto was a important political act for her. And it's only in 1972 that she actually is willing to call herself a feminist in an interview. Feminism is kind of a contested term. The Second Sex comes out in 1949, and we'll talk about that in a bit. That was a very important work. But she's not concerned with being a feminist as such. She's concerned with being an existentialist who's thinking about women and their condition and freedom and responsibility. So she's got a different lens than quite a few other people at the time. 1980, Sartre dies. She lives another 6 years after that, dies of pneumonia in Paris in 1986. You could say, that the very last years of the Cold War. I think we all remember, at that time thinking that the Cold War wasn't coming to an end anytime soon, and then 1989 and 90 and 91 happened, and the world changed radically. She didn't get to see that. Her horizons were brought to a close with a world in which we and the Soviets and all of our allies are facing off against each other. But very interesting things are happening in Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia as they rebuild from the war that the French had first been involved in. Actually the Japanese, and then the French, and then us. And she was very interested in what was going on in what, we talk about the Third World. And, the Third World was an idea that originally didn't just mean underdeveloped places. It was the non-aligned countries that didn't fit into the Second World of Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, and the First World of the United States, the NATO allies, and Japan, South Korea, Australia, and whoever else they wanted to throw in, New Zealand, I guess. So all the non-aligned countries, and France tried to play kind of a role in bringing them together. They never did come together as anything. But de Beauvoir was very interested in liberation movements, in what was going on politically in other places. And she, like many French people, wanted to find something that wouldn't just be doing things the Soviet communist way, and wouldn't just be like, let's do American capitalism everywhere, She was looking for something different. Now, I think you can say that she was very much somebody living within and swimming within the history that was going on at the time. She takes a lot of, you could say, timely matters as her subject matter for her writings. She is deeply concerned about what sort of progress has been made or what progress hasn't been made. She was not a believer in the sort of rhetoric that people use today where they accuse others of being on the wrong side of history, as if history has some sort of automatic movement towards greater and greater freedom. She lived in a time where she saw freedom contracting. if you think about the 1930s and the rise of fascism and the spread of all sorts of nationalist movements that weren't necessarily fascist but were also repressive, and what they did to poor people and what they did to workers and what they did to women, and then the entire colonial sphere, the mid 20th century was not a time of great freedom. As a matter of fact, it was in many ways a shrinking of it. And even in the places where there was a lot of freedom, being sort of protected, it was always kind of selective. Think about the United States, right? We remained a free country. We were devoted to economically a free enterprise system, political freedoms here. Voting took place. There were rival political parties, but if you were an African American living in the South, I don't think you could say you were particularly free. Or if you were a worker and your strike was broken because the war machine must go on, it's much less freedom. Or if you were a woman in general, there was considerably less freedom, and that I think. That was one of the main preoccupations of her thought. And it fit in well with the emphasis in existentialism. Because existentialism, it's hard to define because it's kind of a loose movement, right? But one thing that you can say that they're concerned with across the board is what is the nature of human freedom, when do we have it, and what should we do with it? So Sartre talks about that quite a lot, but she does as well in her works. So I thought, one of the things that would be interesting to discuss, and I've given you some passages here from some of her works, are how this plays itself out. And I do also want to hit on the second sex, but she wrote a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. It's a really excellent work. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a really big, thick book called Being and Nothingness. And, that one, interestingly, this is a bit of a side note, that book was so popular that it actually got used as sort of a meme or, symbol of what it means to, study philosophy. Do you remember the movie Roxanne with Steve Martin, right? So the big dumb fireman, who can't speak very well, and then Martin's character who's got the really long nose. He's supposed to be the Cyrano de Bergerac, so he's a good talker. The big dumb fireman impresses, and I forget who the female lead was. It was just some blonde. Was it Daryl Hannah?
It was Daryl.
Okay, yeah. So she sees him going in the bookstore, and he goes in and he gets Being and Nothingness out of the philosophy section, and he's up at the counter buying it, and she's like, are you reading that? And he's like, yeah, I really like reading this sort of stuff. And he takes it out and he hands it to that little guy with the white hair. I don't remember the actor's name, and he was ashamed to go in and get the book for himself, so he put his big dumb friend up to the task of doing it. But now, why was it Being in Nothingness? Because for the smart set in the 70s and 80s, that was an example of, we know that's a philosophy book, and it's a hard philosophy book, right? So Sartre was that successful, but one thing he was never able to do successfully was develop an ethics, a way of, sort of articulating how we ought to behave. He's got some really cool analyses in there, but he couldn't pull it off, and he admitted it. And who did pull it off? De Beauvoir. She wrote this shorter book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. It's really quite brilliant. And, I've got a couple passages in here for you, so I'm going to just read a little bit of this. She says, the original scheme of man is ambiguous. That's why it's called The Ethics of Ambiguity. He wants to be, and to the extent that he coincides with this wish, he fails. All the plans in which this will to be is actualized or condemned. The ends circumscribed by these plans remain mirages. Human transcendence is vainly engulfed in those miscarried attempts. But man also wills himself to be a disclosure of being, and if he coincides with this wish, he wins. For the fact is that the world becomes present by his presence in it. But the disclosure implies a perpetual tension to keep being at a certain distance, to tear oneself from the world and to assert oneself as a freedom. And then she goes on a little bit later and she says, freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring. It's the original condition of all justification of existence. So we are radically free. That's the existentialist idea. We're free, and then we're confronted with, well, what the hell am I going to do with this, right? And very often we're unsettled by this. So we pick up on something. I'm just going to do this. That'll solve everything. And that's a free choice. You know, if I decide that I'm just a college professor, that's a decision on my part, and I often will conceal that from myself. Or if I think, I'm just a husband or a father, or pick whatever other role we've got, or I'm a good guy or I'm a bad guy, these roles that we take on, we're freely taking them on, and we may be, there's some that we're more interested in than others, right? We have some proclivity towards them. Like I could decide I want to be a great painter, but I suck at that sort of thing, and so that's probably not going to happen. So it would take an awful lot of effort for me to lie to myself daily and say that my awful paintings are any good. But if I want to think that like I'm going to be the next great writer, that's a little bit more feasible. That doesn't take as much BSing of myself to pull off, right? But I could like look at my stuff and say, this isn't really that good. Maybe I need to be honest with myself, and whether I'm honest or not, that's a matter of freedom as well. And when we think about whether we've solved a problem for good, that's a matter of freedom too. We think about, say, personal problems. We have a big argument with somebody in our family, and now we've got a beef, right? And we'll make it something that's it's a sticking point about how to interpret the past. What really went on in our childhood together. Were you a jerk, or was I a jerk, or were both of us jerks, or is it all it was the jerkiness of the time or stuff like that? Did we ever put this stuff behind us? You said we put it behind us, but I'm still upset about it, and that sort of thing. Now, you can tell yourself after you have a good heart-to-heart conversation, we worked everything out. It's all perfect from now on. But the other person can, the next time you're getting together, can say, no, it's not solved, because they're also a free human being. So we live within a matrix of other free beings like ourselves. And wouldn't it be a lot more convenient if they were much more like, technology? And, Siri does talk back, but Siri only talks back in certain ways. And Siri is, very humble and effacing. What can I do for you? Siri doesn't, there are a few things programmed in there. My kids swear at Siri, and Siri says that's not very nice, right? But fortunately, Siri isn't self-aware. Siri's not actually like combating you, but if my kids went up to human beings and talked to them the way they do to Siri, the human being would have a very different reaction to them, and that's because they're a free entity. Now, our freedom isn't absolute in the sense that we can all do anything, anytime, any way we want to, right? It's conditioned by physical factors. Like I'm almost 50 now. I managed to destroy the ligaments, half of the ligaments in one knee. I'm never going to run again. That's okay, because I don't need that bit of freedom. It doesn't affect the other bits of freedom that I'm more interested in, like the freedom to read and communicate and shoot videos and teach. Or cook my own meals or stuff like that. Some people that really would be a major constraint. If your whole identity is built into being the the middle-aged athlete who runs marathons, well, you probably then would want to get the operation where they take cadaver ligaments and stick them in your knee. Me, I don't really need it, so it's not a big priority for me. But I thought about this: like, what if I were to go blind? All the reading I do, I could listen to books on CD, but there's so much that's not available that way. I'd be screwed. That would really affect me in many ways. But then there's all these social conditions too, right? The library is going to close in a certain amount of time, right? So I don't know exactly what time they close, but they're not going to let us stay in here indefinitely. They're going to kick us out. There's certain expectations that we live in, right? A whole network of those. And those are all products of other people's freedom and what we do with it. And some of those run very deep. And so de Beauvoir was analyzing that and saying that's really something that we have to take as central. So now, what do we do with that freedom? She sets out a number of different ways in which people, let's call it misuse. They don't recognize their freedom. They misrecognize it. They get rid of it so they can feel more secure. Because when you realize that you're free, well, there's responsibility that comes with that. And she starts out by talking about children. When we're children, one of the reasons I think a lot of people would like to go back to their childhood, other people are taking care of things. Even if we grew up in a household where maybe we took on more responsibility than most people do, where like maybe you're cooking when you're 6 years old or something like that, or you're watching your younger brothers or sisters because you're the oldest kid, and your parents are divorced and mom is off at work and you're in charge or something like that. For the most part, you're still within the world of childhood where other people are arranging how the world works. And she says we begin as our lives as children who are dependent on others. This is the human condition. And we're embedded, we enter into a world that already has meanings. We don't make it all up ourselves, right? And we learn those meanings, and then we figure out how to get by. And some people are not very successful with that. They never quite get the code. Others, very successful. Maybe they have temptations to become manipulative with it because they realize how easy it is to understand those things. But it's other people's world, and we go into it, and there's things that are kind of ready-made, and there's established authorities. Now, do we develop past that, or do we remain children? Some people never do. Some people want to stay in that groove their entire life. And she calls people like that, she's got two different designations. One is she talks about the serious person. So they learn some values, and it could be they learned them in childhood, or it could be like in adolescence, or it could be they went off to college and learned these values, but they're convinced that these are the sets of values that are correct and all the others are wrong, and this provides the foundation for them. And it could be a political party, it could be a religious standpoint, it could be an anti-religious standpoint, it could be something like everybody needs to make this amount of money, and it could be about just social propriety. But there's something that they take as being absolutely central. That is what the world revolves around. Could be like competing with your neighbors over whose Christmas display is the best, or whose lawn is the greenest, or whose car, is the newest, or stuff like that. But what a person does that way is they avoid taking responsibility for their freedom because, they've got a roadmap out in front of them. She also talks about what she calls the Subman. And the Subman gets rid of his freedom by claiming to subordinate it to values which would be unconditioned. And both of these are ways of refusing to recognize that you're free, that it could be different, that you don't have to do things this way. You get to pass the buck on to somebody else. And it could be, really horrible stuff like, well, I've got to bayonet this guy because he's the enemy, and we all know that's what you do with the enemies of the state. Or it could just be, I have to keep going to work, because that's what you do, not realizing that you can take that on if you want. You can say, yeah, I'm the kind of guy who likes to go to work and keep doing it because that's what I'm choosing for myself. That's a different stance than saying, oh no, I don't have any choice. It's totally up to me, or it's human nature or something like that. Then there's other types, she says, that recognize their freedom, but they misuse it. So she talks about the nihilist. The nihilist is the person who believes in nothing. And she says that they've failed at life, and so they decide not to try anything. She says they're unable to be anything, so they decide, instead of not being anything, to be nothing. And they never take a chance. They disparage everything. The cynics are like this, right? People who are constantly saying things are terrible and they're always going to get worse. Another possibility is being what she calls the adventurer. This is the person who throws themselves into different life projects, and they're interested in having a project. They're not actually interested in where they're going. These are the people who say over and over again, it's not the destination, it's the journey, right? And no, the destination does matter because, some journeys are taking us in the wrong place, but they just say, "Oh, I'm just on my way. I'm discovering things," and they don't see that there's commitments involved there, and they often trample on other people in the process. These are the people who, for example, get out of their yoga class and say namaste at the end, and then they're flipping everybody off in the parking lot trying to get out. And then she talks about the passionate person. The passionate person cares about their goal, and they're super enthusiastic about it, but they show a contempt for other people. They recognize that they have a project that they're committing themselves to freely, but they don't recognize other people's freedom, or they exploit it, or they deny it in some ways. She also talks about other things that are problematic when it comes to freedom, like the artist who says, I'm just an artist, the aesthetic sort of thing where you step back from everything and say, I don't have to really be involved. And her view is that, okay, we're free and other human beings are free, but what we see a lot of the time is that we're not as free as we ought to be. Sometimes because of other people impinging on us, sometimes because of our own bad choices that we've made. And we often place other people in situations where they're less free as well. And what we ought to be doing, if we want to truly be free ourselves, we have to make choices. And this is where it becomes an ethics of ambiguity. We have to make choices that not only make use of our own freedom, we have to make choices that make other people more free. We have to allow them to be genuine agents. So, this ties in very well with her diagnosis of the relations between men and women in the second sex. And she thinks that when it comes down to it, women are in a different position than other people in terms of how things play out. Right, so that's actually where this handout, women as an other, can be useful. Although I see a couple. The PDF didn't quite print out as it should have in some places. She talks about women as being the other to man. Now, this notion of the other is not unique to male-female relationships. You can also talk about it in terms of exploitation, where some people are economically subordinated to others, and they're not allowed to have like a full life, whereas the others have a much more full life because they're appropriating the surplus value, or they put people in servitude, or colonialism is an example of that. You can also do it in terms of ethnicity, where one whole ethnic group is forced underneath another through conquest or slavery or something like that. But she points out that it's different when it comes to women, because this subordination has always been around. Whereas like when it comes to racial categories, the racial categories that we're working with today, they're pretty new, and they're not universal. The census categories that we have are a weird mishmash, right? We have white or Caucasian, we have black, and all it takes to be considered black or African American is the proverbial one drop, right? Which is the only group that's defined that way. We have Native American, and people can check that off on the census, but whether you're actually enrolled in a tribe is something completely different. We have Pacific Islander. We have this vast category, Asian, which covers everybody from South Asia all the way up into, East Asia, but doesn't include Middle Easterners. They're considered white, So Iranians, for example, they're not Asian enough, they're not in the subcontinent. And then we have Hispanic, which is, more of a linguistic category than anything else, because ethnically, what does Hispanic mean? It's a mixing of people of African heritage, Native American heritage, and white heritage, and weird combinations. And then when you go to another country like Brazil, our racial categories don't make any sense there, or South Africa, or other places. But this whole notion of like, somebody being on top, whether it's white Europeans or nowadays in Asia, Han Chinese, versus the Uyghurs or other nationalities. Somebody's on top ethnically. That happened in history. It wasn't part of our original condition. As far as we can go back, somebody beat somebody else and subordinated them and made up some story about why they're superior and why they're inferior. When it comes to labor and capital, those things developed over time. Bosses and owners developed historically. They didn't exist back in the same configurations back in the day. Men and women, there's always been this thing going on. And as opposed to like, say, racial categories or class categories where people live in different places. They may work together, but they live in different places. Men and women live in the same institutions, right? So she notices that this is a very different sort of situation. And she says one group of human beings imposes this subordinate status of the other on another group of human beings. And then, they don't get to behave as fully human. They're not getting to participate, you could say, within the same structures with the same status. And this is still going on today. When I open up my Twitter stream, I don't think a single day goes by without me seeing at least one woman who I follow on Twitter complaining about some less qualified guy mansplaining to them, And if you think about, well, what does that mean? That's where you've got some guy who thinks that because of his status as a male, he gets to tell a, woman PhD in a particular field that because he read some Wikipedia article, she's wrong about her actual area of expertise. And it goes on constantly, The sort of things that de Beauvoir was diagnosing in the second sex, these structures, they replicate themselves over and over and over again. So if you think about it in terms of existentialism, which is what she's doing there, she's very interested in thinking of these in terms of freedom. Women haven't been treated as having the same sort of capacities for freedom as men historically, and in many cases still aren't, right? I mean, there's been vast advances in the last 50 years, but there are still some glaring inequities. My daughter was just complaining the other day about dress codes in her high school and how they're like, they only apply to girls. There aren't any problems with guys dressing in things that are sort of the equivalent of what the girls get criticized for. So there's the issue of freedom, right? And then the question of development. And then there's the question of responsibility. Who is allowed to be a responsible agent? Unfortunately, when you've got the responsibility gets kind of shifted off, right, onto whoever's in the lower position. They end up being more responsible, but it's not being responsible in a full sense because they're not given the freedom to do that. And this plays itself out, in the second sex in terms of men and women. And we could probably expand this analysis today to non-binary people as well. But it also takes place similarly in all sorts of other settings. If we go back to the ethics of ambiguity, one of the big differences between Sartre and de Beauvoir, Sartre holds everybody he says everybody has freedom, everybody has the same amount of freedom, everybody's equally responsible. So if you're a schmuck, you've chosen to be a schmuck on some level, and you're responsible for it. If you're a failed novelist who never the kind of person who hangs out in the coffee house all day and has their laptop and they're like, yeah, what are you doing? I'm working on my novel. And you're like, that's cool. Can I see a chapter? I don't actually have any chapters yet. I've got an outline. And then you see them like 3 months later. How's your novel coming? Oh, now I'm working on short stories. Great. Can I see one of them? Nah, I don't actually have any yet. Sartre would say that person is, choosing to live in a situation of false consciousness, and they're essentially lying to themselves about who they are. And they're going to complain at the end that they never really had a chance to be the great novelist. Conditions kept them from doing it. And Sartre says, tough, you are what you've made yourself. De Beauvoir is much more forgiving the further down you get in you could say, the social hierarchy. If you're on top, she's not going to cut you much slack at all. She's perfectly willing to say that, oh, you're rich and you actually had a good education and you've got all sorts of resources. You're like totally responsible. If you're in a crappy relationship, you could be out of that relationship. You could change your situation. But if you're growing up in the ghetto and you're watching people and just every once in a while beat the crap out of each other, and you've got to watch out for the cops because you can't trust them to not arrest you if you bring things up or give you a hard time because they're frustrated as hell themselves. And if your school that you've got 40 students packed into a room and a lot of them misbehaving and the teacher up in the front just totally frazzled, if you're in a situation like that, you don't have the same kind of freedom and you don't have the same kind of responsibility as the person who's up on top. And so she thinks that, now here's where it gets kind of complicated when it comes to gender dynamics. The ideal is everybody should be as free. You have to recognize that they're not. And yet you also have to work towards making them more free. So liberation is a central part of her ethics. You have to think about, is my action that I'm going to engage in, is it a liberatory action, or does it reinforce conditions and structures that keep people unfree? So, a great example of this, I brought up the Me Too movement. One of the early issues in that, as it was like spreading all across Twitter, is, so do you believe people or don't you believe people when they report that they've been sexually harassed or abused or made out to be uncomfortable or things like that. And there were some people who were like, well, I mean, unless they can come up with evidence, we should treat it like any other case. Let's not believe them. And de Beauvoir would probably say, wow, you're really expecting a lot, aren't you? Evidence, where's that going to like pop out of? What box is that going to be found in? Of course you should like believe until you find out that somebody's like full of crap, and then once then start disbelieving that person, but don't start disbelieving everybody across the board. Instead, you should try to believe them and be in solidarity. And when you do that, you're creating more space of freedom, because people then are emboldened to come forward and say, yes, this Harvey Weinstein guy, just take the most egregious example, he is a dirtbag, and he did do this to me, as well as this person and this person and this person. And, we could look at a lot of different modalities of this. We're often faced with situations where we have to ask, is this the right use of my freedom, and how does this impinge on other people's freedom? Does it make them more free? Does it make them less free? And that's a central part of her ethics. It doesn't cover everything, I think, but it does get you quite a bit of what existentialism was about. So she wouldn't hold, colonized people, except for the elites, as responsible as well-off Americans or French people. But it doesn't mean that anybody gets off the hook. So I've done a lot of talking. We do have some time for any questions before I talk a little bit about her, her own contributions to history, I would say. Do you have any questions or comments? Or?
Well, one of my questions is, was she a believer in communism? Was she a follower of Marx?
Well, so those are, in some respect, two different things. Yeah, I mean, and you can buy into some of Marx without buying other things. Yeah. So, like the notion of alienation, that the way capitalist workplaces are set up alienates people from their product, from each other, from their own human nature. I think she definitely bought into that. In a way, so part of what it means, I guess, to be a communist is not just to have the diagnosis of, working sucks for these reasons, and it could be made better, and it should be made better, but it's the how do you make it better, right? And to the extent, I guess you could say, to the extent that she saw communist or socialist movements as producing greater freedom, she would be behind them. When it comes to like Stalinist Russia, she wouldn't be an apologist for that. She got to see the Cuban Revolution playing itself out, right? And the Cuban Revolution, there were good reasons why they were revolting, right? But they were also receiving aid from the Soviets, and once the Castro regime was in, they cracked down pretty brutally on dissidents and things like that. So I think you could say that she's selective in her endorsement of that, and Sartre is too. He doesn't just say, well, you're a communist, you're the good guys. And another thing too, when you're an existentialist, you realize that any movement can go bad. Because there is this radical freedom, right? So somebody can start out being, a man of the people and liberating everybody, and they can turn into a corrupt person who's just about their own power or vanity or appropriating resources to themselves and ignoring the plight of the poor. I mean, if communism is going to be any good, it has to always perpetually renew its gaze towards the people who are really screwed, the people who are really suffering. But you can say similar things about other political theories, It's interesting. I mean, this is a bit of a digression, but we were talking about this the other day in one of my sessions about when George W. Bush came in. He came in under this platform of what he called compassionate conservatism, and it was supposed to be like an alternative to the, screw you poor people kind of knee-jerk response. And he did try to put into effect some policies that actually, some of them just couldn't get through, like his faith-based initiative, which was going to try to bring churches and other religious institutions into the position of taking care of some social welfare stuff. That probably would have been a good thing to do. He got blocked because of the connection with religion, and then his whole administration basically got themselves off track and into this massive war that's devastated the Middle East and produced like a whole generation of soldiers and Marines and other military people who we now have to take care of, right? In many respects, some of the policies that he had were not terrible policies, and many of them seem to be well-oriented, but the administration easily got off track because it was, sucked in by lobbyists and this interest and that interest, and it looks like the commitment on the part of many of his administration was not very deep to that. That's another thing, too. When you have freedom, with freedom oriented towards genuine human values, like, say, solidarity with the poor, there has to be a deep commitment. And the fact that we're free means that we can abandon that commitment at any point when it's convenient to us, And we have to, recommit over and over and over again when it gets tough. And I think a lot of people just, whether, no matter what political ideology you look at, or what religious institution you look at, or educational institutions, at any moment anybody can abandon their post. What's keeping them there? Their own commitment to keep following through.
Okay, well, how about religion?
Yeah.
I think she was an atheist.
She was an atheist, yeah.
She was an atheist, but would she be against religions? I mean, because they're helping the downtrodden,
that's a good question.
Runs, but they pretty controlling. I mean, they definitely want you to stay in the religion.
Yeah, I think it'd be kind of a case-by-case thing.
Children to be brought up in the religion.
Yeah.
All that. So I could see pluses and minuses from her perspective.
Yeah, insofar as religion is used as a mode of social control, and part of that control is other values besides the religion, be nice, be a good, productive member of society. Sometimes there's political alignments, if you're this, you have to vote this way, and if you're this, you vote that way. And then there's, like you said, the other part of control, keep going into the religious stuff. If you don't go to church every Sunday, you're a bad XYZ or mosque or temple, whatever it happens to be. Make sure you tithe, or the pay to the bishop's fund, or things like that. And then of course there's the hierarchy as well. Usually within most religious groups, even if they don't have an official hierarchy, there's usually somebody who is the authority, right? And so I think she would say that insofar as religion is pushing that, it would be bad, right? But it's also up to us to not to say, well, I was raised that way, and so I had to go along with it. I mean, she would say, no, I don't buy that excuse. Think about one of the ever renewed scandals within the Catholic Church. It never seems to get any better or go away. Is the sexual abuse scandal. I mean, decades now of new revelations about the cover-ups that were going on, and sometimes it's tied in with other things too, spending money on the wrong things, and all these luxuries. And I don't think she would accept for a second anybody saying, oh, well, the priest told me it was okay, so I went along with it, or, I think she had different with children. I think she would say if you had a child who's being abused and they don't know what's what or who's who, and they are being told by the religious authorities, this is what God wants for you, and their parents are like, keep it quiet or something like that, she would treat them as children and say, well, they don't have much responsibility. But by the time they get to be like 20 and are starting to discover these things through psychotherapy or things like that, I think she'd say, no, you have to like take responsibility for yourself, even though it sucks, even though this is not stuff you'd want to look at, and you have to like, stare reality in the face and say, maybe I don't want to be affiliated with this group anymore. I have to find my own path. But I also don't think she'd like be cool with people who like swing way to the other extreme and are like crusaders for atheism just because they left their conservative church upbringing. That's just another way of like being what she calls the serious person. You find a set of values, you think that they solve everything, and you don't have to think about anything anymore. But again, that can happen with economic systems, with political systems. It can happen with philosophy. You could be one of these, if we could just be clear about terms, and like you police everybody's language. If we could just do that, then all the human conflicts would go away. And she would say, well, you got to be wary of committing yourself to those sorts of things as if they're going to solve everything. And one of the things she got criticized for was not having strong women in sort of like in her novels and things like that. And she said, I'm more interested in people who are actually like facing real life challenges, not in these pasteboard characters who exemplify some sort of ideals. I want to actually like write characters who screw up, and I'm just roughly paraphrasing here, right? But who face real challenges and sometimes measure up to them, and sometimes don't, and sometimes feel regret, because that's where we actually make our choices. It's not, the choices are never like, should I do good or should I do evil? It's never so stark as that. It's usually like, should I do this good that comes with some evil, or this kind of good that also comes with evil but might be more good? Maybe. I don't know. Some people are saying this is better, and if the more that I look at it, though, I think I probably should do this. It's usually stuff like that, So yeah, it's a very long answer to the question, but
thank you.
Yeah. Do you have any questions or?
It's so phenomenal.
Oh.
Your dialogue and what you've been able to extract, it's just.
Well, I've been reading her
incredible.
for a long time,
right,
so
but,
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I first encountered her in undergraduate. I mentioned that like I just read whatever the hell I wanted. I got her Ethics of Ambiguity in a used bookstore down here. Actually, I was up in Sheboygan at Lakeland College, but I'd come down here to go to half price books, and somebody must have been teaching it or something like that. So there were a bunch of copies, and I bought one, and I was like, this is really good stuff, The other stuff I read much later, like Second Sex and some of her novels, and Should We Burn Desaad? So yeah.
Do you find it to be complete? A complete philosophy?
Oh, that's a good question.
Where would the holes be?
So, by the very nature of her philosophical position, we're supposed to take account of the situations that we're in, the sort of overarching situations. And, like we said, she died in 1986, so she did not get to see the New World Order, to use George Herbert Walker Bush's phrase, that we effectively live in, where the United States is what the French call the hyperpower for at least the time being, and all sorts of other interesting things happened. She didn't get to see that sort of stuff, so she didn't get to write about that. And we can extrapolate, what would she say about this development or this development, but we don't actually have her saying that about that, right? I think that, there's criticisms of her by other later feminists for not having taken adequate account of things that they think are particularly important. And there are criticisms of her behavior with Sartre, she's all about freedom. It seems like she behaved in manipulative ways with some of these young women that they drew in. Although, there were also like her and Sartre and, her being involved with some other guys too. So, was she entirely consistent? No, but I don't think, I don't think she has to be entirely consistent.
But there's enough of a framework that you could apply it to the
Yeah.
evolving and changing world. And
Yeah.
do you think most academics, whatever, reading would be able to come to something of a consensus on how she would apply?
Oh, that's another good question.
To the new.
Like, what would her views on, say, dating be like in 2019 when we have apps and people are, there's a lot more equality, but it's not like full equality in many respects. I think there's probably there's not like 100% consensus among academics. You never find that.
Oh yeah, true.
But I think you could say there's probably like a critical mass of people who use her thought that would be in agreement, and then there'd be outliers on this side or outliers on this side. And maybe some of the outliers are not as good or reliable interpreters of her. She's very much about responsibility. The more freedom you have, the more responsibility you also bear. She doesn't accept excuses. One thing that she said that was really interesting in The Second Sex was that she did not... She talked about male and female inferiority and equality. And I know they're going to kick us out soon, so this is a good thing to end on. She said, generally it's been, male superiority, female inferiority. Some people want to reverse it so that it's like female superiority, male inferiority. Others are like strict equality is what we need. And then she's like, I don't want any of these things. And then you'd be like, well, what do you actually want then? I want people to like actually be accountable for themselves and relate to each other as human beings and not need some sort of structure where they're like, well, we're all equal now, because it's never totally equal, or, think that one sex is automatically superior and one is inferior. In some respects, she's like another important feminist author who also got a bad rap because she lived a rather unusual lifestyle. That's Mary Wollstonecraft from the 18th century. Wollstonecraft diagnosed some of the same things that de Beauvoir is diagnosing, these kind of sort of self-reinforcing cycles where women are not given the same opportunities to develop, and therefore they're not performing like men do in situations, and then that's the evidence for why we shouldn't give them any opportunities, right? Same thing that's often done with racial minorities or with lower classes and stuff like that. It's an old trick, and Wollstonecraft says we got to break this cycle, but we should also hold everybody totally responsible. So women don't automatically get a pass for everything just because they're stuck in this cycle. As a matter of fact, the really bad thing about it is they've got a false consciousness about how they ought to behave. Men and women both need to be way more, as Wollstonecraft says, more virtuous than they are, which means they need to develop their human capacities fully. De Beauvoir doesn't like language of virtue, of course, because that was kind of moralistic at the time. But she would say men and women both need to, as individuals, use their freedom to develop themselves fully. And I think she thought that most people don't do that, of either gender. So, yeah, so she rejected, replacing inferiority and superiority with equality, and she said that's a mistaken way of looking at the situation, and I think she's right about that. So long as it just doesn't turn into like I'm just going to like stick in my own little area over here. As Voltaire said, we have to cultivate our garden, and the thing that goes, well, screw everybody else's garden, the other stuff doesn't matter. She thought we need to be engaged, which means we're probably never really going to be happy, because there's always more stuff that's screwed up for us to look at.